Good morning, and welcome to the 11th Memorial Symposium in honor of my father, Harvey Preisler. As I was thinking about what to say today, I was suddenly gripped with panic because I realized that with each passing year, so much of what Dad and I did together is fading from my mind. I desperately want to hold on to this memory, yet the once vivid details are slowly but surely vanishing. Many of you have heard me recount the fact that the first words that were whispered in my ear, thanks to Dad, were not Allahu Akbar or Mazel Tov, but actually quantum gravity. Because Dad wanted to instill a love for science in me from the second I was born. Today, I'm about to do something which I've refrained from doing for the last 5 years at this function. I've decided to begin this symposium by showing you a short clip of a typical Sunday morning at our home in Chicago when I was about 4 years old. In this video, you won't see my father's face. He was a man with movie star good looks and an unabashed healthy vanity. When this video was made, however, he was already quite sick and being treated with chemotherapy and high doses of steroids, which had caused his face to swell. On this typical Sunday morning, Dad is having coffee and what he called a pastry that is made to look like a bagel, because of course, no one outside of New York City had any idea what a bagel should taste like. You'll see my mother in the background as well. She had just returned from her daily morning run by Lakeshore Drive. Now, half the people in this room know my mother only socially and are aware of her deep love for the arts, especially for high poetry. She's committed thousands of verses to memory in at least 4 languages, Urdu, Punjabi, Persian, and English, and has a knack for coming up with an appropriate couplet for all my teenage escapades and angst. The latest couplets, incidentally, have been revolving around the theme of Jurat Erindana, or the courage you get from drinking. Anyway, I want to remind those of her friends who only know this literary, artsy side of her that Ummi's love for science and her intellectual curiosity is unmatched. I suspect she knows more about ants than she does about any other subject in the world, because when she came back from Brazil last week, the only thing she brought me was videos of them when she'd sat in the mud and just taped leaf-cutting ants making their little colonies. In the video you're about to see, I direct as many questions to her as I do to my father, because they were both equally instrumental in evoking my passion for science. So here's a short clip from that Sunday morning 15 years ago in 1998.
वैसे लाइट जो है वो बाकी बंद करेंगे आप? I don't like seeing my audience.
Interesting subject, don't you think, Sheher?
What was your question?
How does the brain think? Now let me draw a picture for you about how come ants have big brains. Okay, look here. Ants don't have this big brain. They're real big ones that are this big.
She has some other question. So you asked Betty what's the biggest bird?
What's the biggest bird?
Let's see. You mean the pile of feathers that we saw at the zoo?
No.
The biggest bird in the world,
Yeah.
I think, is a South American condor.
No.
Oh, you mean an ostrich? I mean, the bird wasn't quite. Sorry.
What's the smallest bird?
A hummingbird. But the largest bird that flies is a condor. From South America. It looks like a pile of feathers. It looks just like a vulture.
Look here.
What's the largest mammal?
Look how big the ant's brain is.
How can you get such a big brain to a little body?
Compared to the body. See, this is an ant. Make believe this is an ant.
Okay, it looks like an ant.
How many legs do they have?
6.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I drew 6 legs.
Okay.
3 makes 6. And look at the ants have big brain compared to their human. Where they hear is where do they hear, Mom? Where do ants hear?
Instead of the tympanic membrane, what they have, Sheher,
On their feet?
they have little hairs on their feet. And instead of the tympanic membrane going like this with sound, their little hairs go like this.
As I was writing this tribute for Dad, I realized that even though the exact images of our time together may be fading from my mind, the feelings they evoked, and even more importantly, the consequences of those feelings are very much present with me now. It is exactly what the great Maya Angelou once said. People forget what you say to them. They even forget what you do to them. But they never forget how you made them feel. Dad always made me feel curious about the world around me and excited about exploring more and more of it. He and I often went on excursions to Lincoln Park Zoo, which was across the street from where we lived in Chicago. And as you saw in the video clip, my father, who had an encyclopedic knowledge about all manner of subjects I could imagine, constantly recounted interesting facts and stories about animals, their habitats, plants, trees, and especially about evolution. He also had a great passion for astronomy, and we regularly visited the planetarium on starry nights. With each passing year, I'm forgetting the details of our time together, but the feelings and remaining memories inspire reactions that unconsciously draw me to do many things today. For example, seeing my father sick all the time when I was growing up between the ages of 3 and 8 has had a deeper effect on my psyche than I had imagined. One example is this. As I finished high school, it dawned upon me with an inexplicable vividness and certainty that all I wanted to do with my life was to study medicine and try and help people who are suffering as my father did. This made me realize that the past has a strange way of intruding into our present through memories represented as the unconscious motivation for what we choose to do. This annual memorial function, which my mother started 11 years ago, also provides such a fuel. It is a very unique and beautiful way in which memories of my time with Dad are reshuffled in my mind. And in the process, I relive many of those shared precious moments and feel re-inspired to commit myself more fully to my dreams and more specifically to science and medicine. Another incredibly important consequence of this annual symposium is that even though I've lost a very exceptional parent, his love for science and his relentless search for truth gets transmitted to all of us through the amazing individuals who have been invited to speak here year after year. It's a fitting tribute to Dad that all the speakers in these last 11 years have been at the top of their fields. They've made profound intellectual contributions that have affected the course of human history and shifted paradigms by introducing radically novel concepts. The point is that keeping Dad's memory alive has mediated my introduction to individuals whom he admired and whose lives now serve as a source of direct inspiration for me and fill up some of the gap I necessarily feel now because of my father's absence. How fortunate I am to have met personally the likes of Robert Gallo, Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Craig Mello, Bruce Butler, Siddhartha Mukherjee, Craig Venter, and now Professor Daniel Dennett. And finally, memories serve to remind me that life was perfect and wonderful once. मुझको यकीन है, सच कहती थी, जो भी अम्मी कहती थी, जब मेरे बचपन के दिन थे, चांद में परियां रहती थी. I am certain that what my mother tells me is all true. When I was a child, fairies really did live on the moon. Today we have among us one of the great thinkers of our time. You're about to have the privilege of hearing Dr. Dennett, and before he's even delivered his talk, I'm going to ask him a question that I often think about. We can use the reductio ad absurdum approach to deconstruct memories, but only down to a physical reality of cells and molecules. But when I hear the song, Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer true. I'm half crazy over my love for you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two. When I hear these lyrics, a sleeping neuron gets stimulated in my brain, and certain molecules within it are rearranged, chemicals are produced, and electrical signals are generated that cross thresholds and cell membranes. But how does that physical and chemical process suddenly make me feel an overwhelming sense of joy? Because it invokes the memory of my father pushing me on my first bicycle and singing these sweet lines over and over. What accounts for the feelings? It cannot be consideration generators and it cannot be only the chemicals and the electrical signals. Are memories and past experiences my consideration generators in all my present-day decision-making processes? And if memories are as deterministic about my present as to essentially decide my future career for me, then do I really have free will? Now my mom is going to come and introduce Dr. Dennett.
There's a statement that has been ascribed to Sir Francis Bacon, famous for the use of the scientific method in the 16th century. He reportedly told the collected clergy, "We won't tell you how to go to heaven, but then you don't tell us how the heavens go." If there's one person who will not be caught telling you how to go to heaven, but who's interested in how everything goes, it is Professor Daniel Dennett. Dan is a philosopher, writer, a cognitive scientist whose entire adult life has been devoted to the pursuit of truth. He's interested in the workings of the mind. Dan is interested in thinking about thinking. He's an extraordinary teacher who, in his most recent book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, offers 77 thought experiments that are designed to provoke in you a heartfelt, table-thumping intuition. Yes, of course, it had to be so. I strongly recommend the book to everyone. Dan argues that free will is compatible with determinism. This is unlike the libertarians who believe that because we live in a deterministic universe, free will is not possible. He has also been doing research into clerics who are secretly atheists and how they rationalize their works. And last night over dinner, Dr. Dennett told me that just yesterday was a great day for him because he was able to send the final manuscript for publication. Dan was born in Boston, spent part of his childhood in Lebanon, where during World War II, his father, a scholar of Islamic history, worked in Beirut. He was first introduced to the notion of philosophy while attending summer camp at age 11, when a camp counselor said to him, "You know what you are, Dan? You are a philosopher." Wilfrid Sellers famously said that the aim of philosophy is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So in the subsequent 6 decades, has Dan lived up to that pronouncement he received at age 7? At age 11, I posed this question to one of our mutual friends, Steven Pinker, who was our speaker at one of the Preisler symposia. And this is what Steven wrote back to me, and now I quote, "Dan has a gift of showing that philosophy is not just an arcane academic pursuit, but is woven into our lives, that we are confronted with philosophical issues everywhere we turn. As Molière might have put it, we have been speaking philosophy all our lives. One example is his illustration of the moral question of whether we even have a requirement to put our needs before those of others. And Dan gave the example of the instructions on the drop-down oxygen mask on airplanes that instruct a parent to put on masks on themselves before their children. In another discussion, he considers whether we can even put a value on human creations that exceeds the value we put on human life. He asked, are the guards in the loop armed? Under what conditions would they be allowed to fire their weapons? There are hundreds of examples like these throughout Dan's writing, which make philosophy come alive to every thinking person with a vividness that may be unmatched since Plato. End quote. Dan's books are full of wonderful adages. Some of my favorites are here. The term algorithm descends via Latin, algoritmi, to early English, algorithm, from the name of the Persian mathematician Musa al-Khwarizmi. We need Darwin's gradualism to explain the huge difference between an ape and an apple. And we need Turing's gradualism to explain the huge difference between a hand calculator and a humanoid robot. Neurons don't divide and mules don't procreate, yet both have self-protection instincts. What do neurons buy with their dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin? Greater influence in the network in which they participate, hence greater security. And the best route to competence in any sphere of activity is comprehension. The secret ingredient of improvement everywhere in life is always the same: practice, practice, practice. End quote. One of Harvey's most favorite pieces of writing was the Ecclesiastes. The book is particularly notable for its iconic phrases like "the sun also rises," "there's nothing new under the sun," and "he who increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." I can now safely say that the last bit is not true in case of Professor Dennett, because increasing his knowledge base seems to have increased his enjoyment of life and zest for making the very acquisition of knowledge a fun thing to do. But most importantly, it has managed to sharpen his sense of humor. Dan uses humor as a valuable source of highly refined stimuli to explore the brain's powers, especially to examine the penumbral elements of our consciousness, those hidden dark corners even unknown to ourselves that can respond to a joke. His book, with a great pun as a title, Inside Jokes, is written with Matthew Hurley and Reginald Adams. They tell jokes and quote puns and witticisms to reverse engineer the mind. They explain how you react and why you react the way you do when you hear the following: photons have mass? I did not even know they were Catholic. Why do Germans laugh 3 times when you tell them a joke? First when you tell it, second when you explain it, and third when they get it. The face of a child can say it all, especially the mouth part of the face. And the young men will totally appreciate this one. I don't have a girlfriend, but I know a woman who's mad at me for saying that. And here's one of my favorite jokes from the book. A man who wakes up from his terrible hangover suddenly finds his wife has prepared a beautiful breakfast for him. What could he have done to deserve this? He had come home stinking drunk, vomiting all over everything. His wife had to carry him to the bedroom. When she tried to pull the puke-drenched clothes off his inert form, he had yelled out, "Stop! Get your hands off me, I am a married man." You are laughing 3 times, you know that. In our Muslim tradition, the name Khizr has become synonymous with the word guide, someone who shows you the way. I like to describe Professor Dan Dennett as a present-day intellectual, academic, rational, and cerebral Khizr, who has developed a unique style of showing the way by combining humor and hard facts from across disciplines to initiate his students into thinking more elegantly about cognition and evolution, about competence and comprehension, about free will and consciousness. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to present to you Professor Daniel Dennett.
Aha, I think this is going to work now. Yes. Very good. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Sheherzad, for asking the question that I'm going to try to answer, putting it very well. And thank you, Azra, for that wonderful introduction. I don't know how I can live up to it. I must say I am so honored to be part of this series, to have learned just in the last few days about the amazing family that you have, and to see your friends here today. It is a great honor to be here. So now I'm going to try to tell you what cognitive science tells us about free will. It's an experiment of sorts, because I'm going to abandon the central term of philosophy, which has become almost useless, and that's the term free will. It's become useless for various reasons. I'm not changing the topic. I'm just changing the verbiage. So why am I doing this? Well, the concept of free will is generally seen to have two essential features. First, it's undetermined, that is free will versus determinism. And second, it's required for moral responsibility. Those two standard conditions are in conflict. That's why we've had the free will problem for several thousand years. But people don't agree on how the parts go together. And since people won't abandon the first point, I've discovered, I've tried for years, as Azra says, I'm a compatibilist. I try to say, number one here is just wrong. It's just a mistake. But a lot of people think that they don't even know how to take that seriously. Okay, I'll concede them the term. Okay, free will is not compatible with determinism, so I'm not going to talk about free will. I guess you're right. I'm just going to drop it. So I'm going to talk about moral responsibility instead, the second theme. So let me revise the question. Does cognitive science have anything interesting to tell us about moral responsibility? And we don't have to hassle over whether that's free will or not. And my answer is going to be yes, but it's not what scientists have been saying. And the reason I'm talking on this subject now is because in the last few years there's been a veritable chorus of eminent cognitive scientists saying the same thing. There seems to be a new consensus. So here, for instance, is Wolf Singer, a very eminent German neuroscientist, saying, no one is responsible for their actions since all is predetermined by the brain. And here's Chris Frith in London saying, is it possible to predict people's actions on the basis of neural activity that precedes their conscious decisions? If so, then free will is an illusion. My good friend Sam Harris has a little book called Free Will, about which, let me just point out one thing here, and that's the cover. Putting the marionette strings on the cover is, I think, a shocking mistake, as I will say later on, referring back to this cover. This is jumping to a conclusion that's entirely unwarranted, but we'll get back to that. So here's some praise for Sam Harris. coming from Paul Bloom. He's a very eminent cognitive scientist at Yale. He's the editor-in-chief of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. If you believe in free will or know someone who does, here's the perfect antidote. And picking up on that is my good friend Jerry Coyne, Chicago, very active blogger on evolutionary theorist. Free will is an illusion so convincing that people simply refuse to believe that we don't have it. In Free Will, Sam Harris combines neuroscience and psychology to lay this illusion to rest at last. So that's seems to be quite a chorus of eminent people saying free will is an illusion. It's not just cognitive scientists that say it. A few physicists have raised their voices too. Here's Stephen Hawking. Recent experiments in neuroscience support the view that it's our physical brain, following the known laws of science, that determines our actions, not some agency that exists outside those laws. It's hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. Same theme. And then one more. A being endowed with higher insight and more perfect intelligence, watching man and his doings, would smile about man's illusion that he was acting according to his own free will. And who said that? Well, I think you've heard of him. So as a powerful army of experts that are arrayed against me here, there are a few exceptions. My good friend Michael Gazzaniga is an exception. He's a neuroscientist who has thought carefully about this and continues to work with philosophers on this issue. Now you might wonder, well, is this a tempest in a teapot? Is this serious? And I think the answer is yes, it is. I'll tell you why. It's an experiment that was done. So here's a passage by Francis Crick from his well-known book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. Let's read it. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. He goes on. So although we appear to have free will, in fact our choices have already been predetermined for us and we cannot change that. Now I agree with everything on the first slide. Yes, that's what our brains are, and that's how our decisions are made. But I don't agree with the second part. We'll see why. Or at least, if I were to hang on to the term free will, I'd say that. So what's the importance of this passage? Well, Catherine Vos and Jonathan Schooler at Santa Barbara did an experiment where they had half the subjects read this passage, and then they gave them a puzzle to solve for a cash reward. A control group read a different passage from the same book, had said nothing about free will, and they were given the same puzzle. Both groups had the opportunity to cheat. The first group cheated significantly more. This is an unsettling result, and whenever you get an unsettling result, people try to replicate, and yes, replication has been pretty convincing. And Jonathan Schooler has done a host of related experiments. This is fairly robust. So it is serious. Telling people authoritatively that they don't have free will encourages them to behave badly. Well, maybe if they don't really have free will, then this is what you've got to do, tell the truth and take the consequences. But there's another side to it. So I've wanted to have an intuition pump to alarm my neuroscience friends. These people, all the people I'm quoting, these are my friends. It's very embarrassing because I know them all well, and I say, John, come on, guys, you're not getting it. So here's a little thought experiment that I invented just for them. I call it the nefarious neurosurgeon. So first, a little bit of science fact. Damian Denise in Amsterdam has developed a little microchip that can be surgically installed in your brain, and it pretty well controls obsessive compulsive disorder. It's been installed now in several dozen, at least, patients. I don't know what the latest number is. And the results so far are very encouraging. So if you've got OCD, you can get a little chip installed in you and pretty well take care of your OCD. That's fact. Here's science fiction now. So this fellow who has OCD goes to see his local brilliant neurosurgeon and asks for the installation of the chip, and she duly puts it in and tests him in the fMRI machine, and as she's sewing him up and about to send him off into the world, she says, so now you won't have OCD anymore. Chip will take care of that. Oh, and by the way, our team here will be monitoring you 24/7, and you will have the illusion that you have free will, but in fact, we'll be making all your decisions for you. Have a nice life. Goodbye. And sends him out the door. And because she was wearing a white lab coat and had all that shiny gear, he believed her. And as you might imagine, his behavior began to get a little bit negligent. He began to indulge in some of his worst whims, and pretty soon he got in trouble with the law. And he's called up before the judge, and he says, well, Your Honor, you know, I don't have free will. My neurosurgeon told me that when she implanted the device. They're making all my decisions for me. Really? So they called the neurosurgeon to testify under oath, and they asked her, did you tell him this? She says, oh yeah, I did. I was just messing with his head. It was sort of a joke, you know. Now think about that. Did she do something evil? I think she did. In fact, she accomplished with her little joke what she claimed to accomplish surgically. She took away his free will. She disabled him as a moral agent. And most of the cognitive scientists I tell stories to, they say, oh yeah, bad girl, this is not good. I said, well, tell me exactly, aren't you just doing that same thing wholesale when you stand up in your white lab coat and tell the world in one publication or another that nobody has free will and nobody's responsible? And people believe you because you're scientists? So now what's the difference? Well, there are differences, of course, which the thought experiment highlights. And in particular, the difference is that what she told him was that he was a marionette. There was somebody else controlling him, somebody else making his decision. If you're a marionette, if somebody else is controlling your decision, then you aren't free. But who says that there's any agent out there controlling your decision when you're just in the world? The environment is not an agent. It is not an agent that is manipulating you. It's just the indifferent environment. It has lots of effects on you, but it is not trying to control your every move, and that makes a big difference. Where the scientists went wrong is that they took the first feature, indeterminism, as definitive. That made them incompatibilists, and then they drew the conclusion that since brain states determine our decisions, we can't be responsible. That's feature 2. It's a familiar idea, but I think it's incoherent on closer inspection. And here I trust my dear friend, Dilbert. Scott Adams at his best is wonderful. Here, I'm going to do panel by panel. Do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Of course. Then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. So you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. You think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up. That panel, that strip, I think perfectly captures the view that's out there, the view that these scientists, by the way, are falling for. And so that people get the idea that unless there's some mysterious, weird sort of causation going on, they can't be morally responsible. We can't blame people for anything they do. Dilbert comes through one other time. I can't resist this. This came out somewhat more recently, one of my favorite slides. Now, free will is an illusion. Humans are nothing but moist robots. Just relax and let it happen. Ever since this came out, moist robot has entered my vocabulary as a sort of technical term because it perfectly encapsulates what I've been saying for 40 years. That's what we are. We're moist robots, made of robots, made of robots. No magic ingredients. We're not made of silicon, but it's the last sentence there, so relax and let it happen, that I think is false. I think that's where the problem is. I'll let free will be an illusion in that incompatibilist sense. Yeah, that we don't have that magical property. We don't need it. Here's another eminent commentator on the scene, Tom Wolfe, in an essay with the evocative title, "Sorry, but your soul just died." And this is his reflections on neuroscience and its implications. And he doesn't do his homework very well because he identifies E.O. Wilson and me as neuroscientists. But who's counting? Here's what he says. The conclusion people out beyond the laboratory walls are drawing is, the fix is in, we're all hardwired. That, and don't blame me, I'm wired wrong. So this is what Tom Wolfe says is the message that's coming out of the laboratories. And he doesn't like it. He's upset by this. Well, wired wrong? Wired wrong? What would it be to be wired right? Or, to pursue the issue a little more pointedly, could we be wired right for responsibility? What would it take for a moist robot to have moral responsibility? And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. What would it take for a moist robot to have moral responsibility? And does cognitive science show that these requirements cannot be met? And the answer I'm going to come up with is no. No. And I'm going to do this by a little invention that I'm going to call the Moral Agents Club. Moral responsibility I'm going to treat as eligibility in the Moral Agents Club. We members make the rules, which are not entirely arbitrary. Rules often require bright lines. Consider, for instance, the rule that says you have to be 16 before you can get a driver's license. Is 16 the perfect age? Well, maybe 15 would be better, or maybe 17 or 18 would be better. That's a political decision that we make on the basis of empirical information, but metaphysics doesn't tell us where to draw the line. This is something we can decide on, but once we decide on it, we set it as a rule, and we don't countenance arguments about this. If you're the most mature 15-year-old in the world, don't even ask if you can have a driver's license. And for that matter, if you're a shockingly immature 18-year-old, if you can pass the test, you can get out there and drive. And we prefer it that way. We can move the line, but we need to have that bright line. And then there's penalties for violations. That's something we do when we set up the Moral Agents Club. Now, does this mean that we set up a bunch of illusions? Well, let's consider illusions. Sunsets. How many of you think that sunsets are an illusion? Are sunsets real? Yeah, they are. I mean, you can count them and see them, and some are better than others. They're certainly part of our manifest image. We understand they're not quite what you might have thought they are, but they're real. How about colors? I was told just the other day by a graduate student in psychology in Santa Barbara that vision scientists had shown that color is really an illusion. I said, oh, really? So are you going to sue the Sony people for selling you that so-called color television set? Are you going to take Sherwin-Williams to court for fraud, for claiming to sell you colored paint? There's clearly a sense in which colors are not an illusion. They're real. They're just not what you might think they are. The science of color gets very interesting. It's a philosophically, conceptually fascinating field. Recent discoveries about color vision shows, first of all, we really shouldn't call it color vision. But that's another story. How about these? How many of you think home runs are real? I think so. How about attorneys? How about doctors? How about bishops? Dollars, pounds sterling, and euros, are they real? Words, are they real? Sure. They're all real too. What they are is real social constructions. They depend on us, on understandings that we have. Now, here we have to be very careful. I am not talking about the postmodernist idea of the social construction of reality, which I think is bosh, to put it politely. Mountains are not social constructions. Electrons are not social constructions. Planets aren't social constructions. But there are social constructions, and those are the construction of social realities. Home runs are social constructions. They wouldn't exist without human beings to have, in effect, created them. This is something, by the way, that John Searle is right about. He makes a big point of saying it's not the social construction of reality, it's the construction of social reality, and I think that's exactly right. So this perspective on moral responsibility is foreshadowed by Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan and by contractarian theories, where the idea is we created moral good and evil when we formed the social contract. That's a sort of just so story that he tells. We created moral responsibility at the same time. You remember that Hobbes says that life in the state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short, and that animals have no morality. Not morality, as it were, with a capital M, and I think most of us agree. Animals are amoral. That they eat and kill each other and there's pain and suffering, but they're not moral agents. Morality is something which we brought into existence when we formed societies. The rational reconstruction is the social contract. And I'm saying something similar, of course, by talking about the Moral Agents Club. So is moral responsibility real? Or is it an illusion? Consider it as real as dimes, dollars, and doctors. Pretty real. Or maybe, I haven't shown that yet, but this is what I'm going to defend. That is, that if you wonder whether science shows that there's no such thing as moral responsibility, so does science show there's no such thing as a dollar? Or a doctor? I mean, there's people, yeah. Homo sapiens, science shows us that. But some of them are doctors. Is that real? Is that a real distinction? It's a real socially constructed distinction. So from this perspective, then, we can look at the specs for a morally competent agent. if you're going to be a member of the Moral Agents Club, you have to meet these conditions. And they're obvious, much discussed. First, you have to be well informed. And not just in general. You have a particular responsibility, which you are encouraged to act on, to keep yourself well informed about morally significant matters. So that when we learn of some new harm that we hadn't really fathomed or appreciated before, you have a responsibility to update your knowledge to include that. You can't just say, oh, I didn't know. Maybe you didn't know, but you should have known. You should have known. There is an obligation to be well informed. And you've got to have roughly well-ordered desires, not have obsessive-compulsive disorder that it disables you. You may have OCD, but it may not disable you for the morally significant decisions in your life. A Kantian condition, you have to be moved by reasons. That is, if somebody gives you a reason, speaking or writing, you can understand it. You can be persuaded, convinced, talked into or out of some course of action. If you're not, then you're not eligible for moral responsibility. We treat small children this way. We don't say they haven't yet reached the age of reason, and this is what that means. Now we're getting into something a little more important. Very important that you not be controlled by another agent. And you have a responsibility for maintaining that, for guarding yourself against falling into the clutches of puppeteers. And it turns out you've got to be punishable. I'll say more about that in a minute. And then comes the one that is the favorite of the free will literature, that you could have done otherwise. That when you act, it will be true of you that you could have done otherwise under the circumstances. So those, I think we'll tentatively say those are exhaustive, those 6 conditions on moral competence. So now, come on, time to switch. There we go. I want to look at condition 4 as not controlled by another agent. So here's 4 cases. I want you to think about them. My doctor tells me that bran blobs would be good for my heart, and I trust him. He's a good doctor, so I go out and buy some bran blobs. That's case 1. Case 2, I'm in the supermarket. I read the claims by Kellogg's on their box of bran blobs, and right there, highlighted in yellow, it tells me all the health benefits of eating bran blobs. And I buy a box of bran blobs. Case 3, I see a box of bran blobs with a gorgeous picture of Cameron Diaz on it, and I buy it. Case 4, I see a box of bran blobs which has a secret microchip transponder that tweaks my nucleus accumbens, and I buy it. Now notice that in all 4 cases, another agent has caused me to buy bran blobs by doing something to me. By telling me, my doctor advising me, by printing something that I found convincing on the package. In the 3rd case, let's say, I'm not a babe in the woods. I know how advertisers use sex to sell. But in my case, I just decided that I would enjoy rewarding Kellogg's for their good taste in women. It's the 4th case that's really troubling, because I don't know about it. It's secret. It's a manipulation that is beneath the radar. Notice that if microchips with that property became available and became used, we would all be in the market for a detector disabler device, precisely because we recognize our responsibility to try to maintain ourselves as free from secret manipulations of just that sort. The Cameron Diaz case is interesting because A naive person, we might say, is really being manipulated without realizing it by that case too. But you know, grown-up, sophisticated people like me, we know it's as completely transparent what's going on with Cameron Diaz's picture on the box of cereal, and I think we can discount that as a nefarious and a surreptitious influence on me, although on a young, sheltered person from another culture, it might be really bad form. It might be almost as bad as the microchip. The difference is transparency versus secrecy. Being caused by the intervention of another agent to do something X does not mean being controlled by another agent. So one of the rules of the Moral Agents Club is protect yourself from secret manipulators. Now recall Sam Harris's jacket cover, the book cover, with the marionette strings. Question, are there secret manipulators everywhere all the time? Are we being secretly manipulated by the environment? Well, no, because we can distinguish between the cases where we really are being secretly manipulated from the other cases, and we think that it makes a moral difference. If I decide I want a clamshell off the beach to put my loose change in, and there's 1,000 clamshells on the beach, I'll pick up one of them, doesn't matter much which, and no doubt I will be determined to pick that one up by the conspiracy of the photons that strike my eye and position of my limbs when I get the idea and reaching over and picking it up. Big deal. So it's all determined, but I'm not being manipulated by nature. I just happen to be caused to pick up that one. There's no other agent that's trying to make me do that. I'd pick that up of my own free will, even though I was caused to pick it up. So now let's look at punishable. The importance of this is not often discussed, but I think I can make it vivid for you. I asked, wrong button. There we go. Slide out of order, I guess. Let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, here we are. A couple of years ago, I co-taught a course with a colleague, a roboticist at Tufts, and one of the assignments I gave the students was not to make a robot, but to describe the specs of a robot that could sign a contract. Not as a surrogate for somebody else, not that I could have a robot that could go out and sign in my name, as it were, but a robot that you would sign a legal contract with. And when you think about it, you realize, well, the other conditions have to be met. But first of all, what's my redress if the robot breaks the contract? What recourse do I have when the contract is violated? And don't I have to worry about that? Isn't part of, because a contract's a promise, making a promise, being vulnerable to redress in case I break the promise. The brilliant economist Tom Schelling has some wonderful examples that bear on this. One of my favorite thought experiments. So suppose that you're kidnapped and you're still alive and your kidnapper has thought better of it and would love to just let you go, but you've seen his face, you know him, so he figures he's got to kill you. And you promise you will never turn him in. He's not going to believe you. What could you do? What could you do so that he'd believe your promise? Anybody got an idea? What you could do is confess to a serious crime that you had committed and provide all the evidence enough to convict you and give that to the kidnapper. Say, now, we're in the same boat. I promise I won't reveal this, and you promise you won't reveal that. Now we're on the same page. You might save your life by doing that. Well, what if you haven't committed any serious crimes? Probably you haven't. Well, you might commit one right there and then. Give the fellow lots of evidence for it. Or maybe just permit him to photograph you doing some outrageously obscene behaviors or something. You've got to have, as they say, skin in the game. That's why playing poker for matchsticks is no good. There's got to be hurt in the offing in a game like that for it to be serious. And the same is true of every promise we make. Many of you own a house or a car, have a mortgage. Are you qualified to sign a contract? Of course you are. Then you're a member of the Moral Agent Club. I recently signed a mortgage statement, and it was delighted when the notary public asked me, reading off her official list of things to say, and did you sign that of your own free will? And I said, yes, I did. That's the sense of free will that I think is perfectly real. And cognitive science has nothing to say about how that might be jeopardized by anything cognitive science has learned. Consider, you sign a contract, suppose you renege, what happens next? You pay a penalty, it's a penalty clause. What happens if you are a scofflaw and you don't pay the penalty? Well, you might be assessed punitive damages in some conditions, or you might, the person might take you to court and sue you, and you might defy the court and refuse to participate in it. At some point, you're going to go to jail. And when you go to jail, you're being punished. For rehabilitation? No, for punishment. This is the punishability requirement for moral responsibility. So what I've just given you is a very swift and dirty consequentialist sketch of why punishment is okay. A lot of people, there's sort of two views about punishment, retributive and consequentialist ethics. And I'm saying this is a consequentialist defense of punishment, not retributive. And here's the way it works. You're an intentional system. That's my term for something with beliefs and desires. Some of your desires are stronger than others. Thus, law can be an artifact that takes advantage of this. By yoking together, yoking your strongest desires, the desire to stay alive, to be free to move about, not to be in pain, turning those into constraints on your behavior. You hostage your most strong desires, and that turns you into a civilized human being. And these constraints are the very conditions on civilization. So now we're ready finally to look at the deal breaker, could have done otherwise. Does it mean what tradition claims? And I say, no, it doesn't. Absolutely not. It does not. We don't have to deny determinism to have moral responsibility. It simply means what it has to mean to play the role it plays in our social practice of holding people responsible. When the notary public said, did you sign this of your own free will? And I said, yes, I was acceding to that requirement. I wasn't saying anything about whether my behavior was quantum indeterministic or anything like that. It's simply irrelevant. Now, some people, the incompatibilists and the retributivists, are deeply suspicious of this move. My friend Michael Moore has called it compatibilism on the cheap. And as so often before, my old friend Jerry Fodor has the perfect expression of it. One wants to be what tradition has it that Eve was when she bit the apple. Perfectly free to do otherwise. So perfectly free, in fact, that even God couldn't tell which way she'd jump. Now, why does one want that? Well, one wants to be unpredictable. Why? To avoid manipulation by other agents. That's condition 4. But that's the only reason. What we're talking about is practical free will. Practical free will means being unpredictable by the agents you're apt to encounter. Now, finally, I'm ready to talk about the experiment, the most recent experiment that has most galvanized a lot of people in the field, by Soon et al. In Nature Neuroscience back in 2008. And I'll describe the experiment so that you can see why it might really convince you don't have free will. It allows, they say, to predict some decisions up to 10 seconds in advance. Well, we'll see that's a little bit of a misdescription. But here's the experiment. You're sitting in front of a screen, and letters K, T, D, Q, V appear, and they stay on for half a second, 500 milliseconds. And at some point, after you're sitting there, you're supposed to just decide to push button with the left hand or push button with the right hand. Doesn't matter which, entirely free choice, entirely up to you. Some point when they felt the urge to do so, quoting from Soon, they were to freely decide between one of two buttons operated by the left and right index fingers, press it immediately. In parallel, they should remember the letter presented when their motor decision was consciously made. So this is an improvement on the old Libet experiment, which some of you may know about, which galvanized an earlier generation, misgalvanized an earlier generation of theorists. So you got the picture. There you're sitting there, and on a whim, you decide to push the right button, and you just remember what letter was visible. Now that's going to tell the experimenters within half a second of when you consciously decided. Okay? What you do after you've decided, they show you this screen down here at the bottom, and you simply press the button for which symbol was on the screen when you made the decision. Why do you do it that way? Well, you're in an fMRI machine, you see. You're having your brain scanned while you're doing this. And I won't go over the details of the slide except to point out that it's this negativity there that is the key. And this is -8 right there. This is -8 seconds before decision time, or before conscious decision time. So the idea is that by massaging the data from a scan that's been going on, they can find premonitory, prophesying activity in the brain up to 8 or 10 seconds before the subject thinks that they are deciding. So that's pretty exciting, pretty interesting. Now I got to put predict in scare quotes because they can't do it in real time. The data analysis and massaging, the data mining that has to go on to pull out the signal that allows this so-called prediction takes half an hour. But you know, if the subject's choices are written down when they happen and put in a sealed envelope, then you know, an hour later, the neuroscientists can predict what the envelope, what the decisions will be when the envelope is open. So it's not real-time prediction, but it's scientific prediction. Now I think this is an interesting result, a very interesting result, one that you might not have expected. And I think it has a very important moral. Here it is. Don't play rock, paper, and scissors for money with Soon when your head is in an fMRI machine. And I think that's the only moral. I don't think it has any implications for free will at all. But remember, you got to keep from being manipulated, so you got to keep your list secret. You know, if you're going to play rock, paper, and scissors, your best strategy is to play at random, because then there's no pattern to your moves, and nobody can do better than even money against you. But if you write your random choices, rock, paper, scissors, etc., down on a list, you better keep that list secret. Because if somebody else can get your list, then of course they can turn you into a money pump. Now, the Soon effect, which has been much written about, is actually an adaptation for free will in a very interesting analysis by one of my students, Liam Clegg, now at Caltech. And this piece that hasn't been published in a journal yet, but it's on his website, called Protean Free Will, where he argues with a game theoretic analysis that it's actually good that you don't know what decision you're going to make till just before you make it, because in a way the point is obvious. It's like poker players are looking for what's called a tell. If you have a tell, is there something about your behavior, your physiognomy, the way you breathe, the way you sit, that gives a clue as to whether you're bluffing or not? Good poker players are very good at reading other poker players, looking for a tell. If you're playing rock, paper, and scissors, you don't want to have a tell. And if you yourself don't know what you're going to choose, even though your brain has already cooked up it's going to be rock this time, or it's going to be the left button this time, you're better off not knowing it, because that way you're protected against being manipulated by another. A few more words about the law here. The law, like all our effects, is a compromise in a cost-benefit calculation. It's a practical solution to a problem. So what happened is we came up with this wonderful idea of the Moral Agents Club. Now, I've been putting it all in terms of laws and crimes, but that's just the formal side of things. I'm talking about all transgressions, all sins, and all holdings responsible. There's great benefits, but you have to live by the rules. What are the benefits? The benefits are security, reliability, trust, living in a world where promises can be made and kept. Very, very important. This is a consequentialist defense of a system of law and punishment. It's not retributivist. Now, is it fair that to exclude some is ineligible? Well, you know, some really are wired wrong, to get back to that finally. Some people are demented or have brain damage or are retarded, and we don't hold them responsible. They're morally incompetent through no fault of their own. They are different from those of us who are morally competent. The rest of us, lucky us, are competent. Now, there are problem cases. There are cases like psychopathy and various other conditions which very worrisomely straddle the bright lines that we're trying to draw. But that's no argument against the having of bright lines, just as we're going to have to work hard to resolve these cases in not a metaphysically sound way, in a politically satisfactory way. There are no metaphysical bright lines there. But we have to come to some hard decisions, and this is where cognitive science can help. We have to draw lines, and as I said some years ago, and then we don't look too closely. Like the driving law age. We set it, and then the topic's over, at least for a while. Now, one critic of mine has objected to this. Bruce Waller, in an interesting book called Against Moral Responsibility, he's grasped the nettle and really argued this. He thinks I'm wrong and evasive when I say don't look too closely. And I'm inviting people to avoid an investigation which would reveal the bitter truth, namely that free will is an illusion and that moral responsibility is an illusion. But that's not my point at all. My point is made clearer if you think of a similar case. The fact that Jan is morally responsible and Fran is not is, I think, a socially instituted fact. No matter how similar Jan and Fran are, we've drawn the line and we say that, and then we don't look too closely. That's the case that bothers him. But look, we do this all the time. It's like the fact that this 350-foot fly ball is a home run and this 349-foot fly ball is an out. There's nothing metaphysical about the line. We just drew it somewhere, and that's where we drew it. And I don't think we want to change the rule of baseball so that when somebody hits a 349-foot fly, we put in an elaborate formula about how old the person is and whether the wind was blowing and 75,000 other things, and then we just say, well, all things considered, we think it was enough like one that went over the fence, so it should count as a home run. No, we don't do that. That would be looking too closely. We say, nope, sorry. If you don't like the rules, don't play baseball. The home run rule is fair because it's been negotiated by the likely participants. If you don't like it, don't play baseball. You can live like a hermit if you don't want to be part of society, but then you forego the benefits. What happens is then we have to tune over the years the punishment system. Our goal is to preserve credibility while minimizing suffering. We want people on the verge of committing a crime to think, if I get caught, I will be punished with a probability close to 1. That's enough to deter most people. Some agents, however, are just grossly undeterrable, and we exclude them from the club. Children, idiots, people with a gun at their back, and so forth, we exculpate them. We do not hold them morally responsible. We excuse them. And then there's an arms race. Other agents try to exploit the loopholes. No matter what rules and laws and understandings we have, there are loopholes. And they try to exploit them, so then we have to revise the laws, and then they're exploited again and revised again. There's a sort of opponent process in the law which keeps it going over the centuries, and then gradually the law evolves. And our understanding of what's responsibility changes with time. As we learn more excusing conditions, we adjust who we hold responsible. We decide, oh, people used to think these folks were responsible. They're not. We now know more about how they're put together, how their competence rests in their brains, and we now no longer think of them as responsible agents. We haven't abandoned the concept of responsibility. We've simply learned that a group of people don't meet the conditions that we've set. We revise again. Now, some people worry that if we continue this, as we learn more and more and more, eventually nobody will ever be held responsible for anything. This is what I've called the specter of creeping exculpation. There's no worry about this, because there's a very powerful force in the other direction, and that is the rights and privileges of citizenship are so valuable that we don't want to be excused. This is obvious in relatively trivial case. I'm driving down the highway, I get pulled over by a state cop for driving too fast. Do I say, oh, officer, I'm a philosophy professor. You know how absent-minded we are. We really can't keep our mind on something like this. I couldn't have done otherwise. No, I wouldn't do that, because he'll say, okay, we'll take you off the road. Hand over your license if you're really incompetent. No, I want to get back on the road. I'm competent. I'll pay the fine. I'd rather pay the fine and be allowed back on the highway. That's, in a nutshell, the principle that we all rely on to protect ourselves against the specter of creeping exculpation. This way, we politically enforce a boundary between those who are responsible and those who are not. It's a practical, not a metaphysical boundary. I'm going to pass over that. Oh yeah, no, just the last slide. One thing. Here's where cognitive science tells us a lot. It can teach us about differences in the competences of moist robots. Not that none of us have moral responsibility, but that some do and some don't, and cognitive science can help us tell which are which. These are all artifactual distinctions that we have agreed to play by. Now, aren't we coerced into playing the moral game by being raised in a society that has punishment? No, it's a good deal for almost everybody. We're constantly trying to improve it. If we weren't, then maybe it wouldn't be a good deal. Well, how do we do that? Well, what about toxic upbringings? Well, it depends on the effects. Is it fair? Luck is involved. Some are luckier than others. I have said that luck averages out in the end, and Waller, in this book of his, says nonsense. And then he tells a bunch of true tales about people that had bad beginnings, terrible childhoods, toxic childhoods, and then spiraling relentlessly down into a life of crime and degradation, and people that started with good lives rising blithely up. And he tells a bunch of these tales and says, you see, the luck doesn't average out. But that shows nothing, actually. Just think of it. Suppose that in the US there are 3 million cases of amplified good and bad fortune of the sort that Waller describes. 3 million. Woo. Does that prove it? No. Suppose that among the 314 million others, there are about as many deprived childhoods that led to happy outcomes as privileged childhoods that led to deplorable results. If you don't do the statistics, you don't know. You can't just generalize from a few cases. Remember, part of the arms race is a continuing effort by society to address this very issue and to redress the balance with compensatory remedial programs. I'm just going to give you one example to show that this is for real. The marshmallow effect. Some of you may know about this. Walter Mischel's experiment way back in 1970 with delayed gratification takes kids about, 4 to 6, this was done at Stanford, and he puts them in a room and he puts a marshmallow in front of the kid. Says, if you can go 15 minutes without taking the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows and a second one. Then he goes out and he leaves the camera on, and these kids, if you see the film, it's just adorable. There's a lot of it on YouTube and so forth. And they're looking away and covering their faces and turning away and trying to distract themselves in various ways. A small group, about a third, got the second marshmallow. That is, they waited a full 15 minutes. A third, roughly, took the first marshmallow very soon. So there's a lot of variation in these kids. Age is important. The older you are, the better you are at delayed gratification. But they identified real patterns. Now, here's the bad news. That was in 1970. These kids have been followed up over the decades. And the kids that took the first marshmallow right away, statistically, very significantly, involved with crime, unwanted pregnancies, drug addiction, the whole bad 9 yards. So it really looks like an ominous signal from childhood. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there have now been developed non-invasive training methods that can make the effect go away. This is where cognitive science can really help. It's like eyeglasses for the mind. We can seek to identify those foibles and failures of competence in our fellow human beings that can be addressed, and at least we can forewarn them that they are going to be particularly susceptible. And some of this is already well known. Some groups know that they are more susceptible to alcoholism, for instance, than other groups given their genetic backgrounds, and so they can be well advised to worry about this and to take steps. Okay. So what happened here? Some neuroscientists and psychologists want us to abandon the concept of moral responsibility, but I think they're just not thinking clearly. They don't want to abandon the practice of promising. They want to live in a world where there's promising. They say they want to abandon punishment. Well, what they want to abandon is the evil, obscene system of punishment that we have in place in the prisons now. I agree with them. It is disgraceful, and we should certainly reform it. But they want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They want to say, we're going to live in a world without punishment at all. I don't think they're thinking clearly. They're thinking of retributive punishment, which is an eye for an eye, sort of nasty. And I'm talking about defensible punishment, defensible in terms of its consequences. So there's the Moral Agents Club. I'm happy to be a member of the Moral Agents Club. I'm lucky to be a member. I take steps to preserve my membership in good standing. I think we need to reform the practices significantly. Meanwhile, it's the best deal in town. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was great. I'm sure everybody enjoyed this. So the plan now is that we are going to have a maybe 15 or 20 minutes in which I will ask Dan 3 questions, after which we will open this to all of you, and I look forward to getting comments and questions from everybody.
Fine.
So Dan, the first question is from my younger brother Azra Raza, who is now living in Italy, but who was studying you when he was a graduate student at Columbia University with Professor Akhil Ilhami. And he has sent me this question from Italy, and he asked me to read it verbatim. Could you say a few words about how evolutionary theory would have any explanatory force in a completely deterministic universe? After all, chance variation is the heart of how evolution proceeds. Do you really believe that if time were rewound to say some specific moment before the Cambrian explosion, the universe could then unfold in exactly the same way up to this moment, with my sister still sitting in this room reading this exact question to you? If so, then what's the point of an evolutionary theory? Particles have simply magically crossed paths in such a way that they ended up creating this exact world, and it could not have been otherwise. This is like the tornado blowing across a junkyard and by chance assembling the scraps lying around into a Boeing 747. I find this impossible to swallow. What am I getting wrong? Another way of saying the same thing is this. Suppose our universe is actually a simulation being run on a giant Turing machine. In this case, we know that our universe is completely deterministic. Could a universe being run on a Turing machine with no input from outside, once it started, really contain evolutionary processes? And would intelligence and consciousness arise in such a simulated universe? I can't see how it could, because there is no randomness present to allow natural selection to take a foothold. Now my head hurts.
I think this is this a good volume? Okay. That's a wonderful question, because it sharpens a familiar idea much more sharply than I've seen it before, and I really appreciate it, because I think I have a very good answer for it.
Excellent, he'll be happy.
Let's take the work backwards from his second case, the computer simulation. Every computer has a random number generator as part of its underlying firmware or hardware, and programs routinely consult the random number generator and get a random input to do one thing or another. But that's not really random. It's pseudo-random, as we say. That's all evolution needs, is pseudo-randomness. So what's pseudo-randomness? It's patternlessness. And we've got that whether determinism is true or not. In classical deterministic physics, we can draw a sharp distinction, really, between processes which are chaotic and processes that are very regular. And pseudo-randomness is what happens for chaos. Think of a coin flip. It's our very model of a random event. Is it really random? Is it quantum random? Doesn't have to be. It's an event which is so sensitive to, actually, by Michael Berry's a physicist at Bristol's done these calculations. If you really wanted to predict a fair coin flip from the physics, you'd have to know the position of every electron in the visible universe to within, a millimeter or something because of the gravitational forces. In other words, it is utterly unpredictable in any practical sense, even though it's deterministic. But the thing is that these patternless, and if you flip the coin 1,000,000 times and look at the results, if it's a fair coin, you will have a nice random series. That would be a great series to use to play rock, paper, and scissors with if nobody could read your list. Now, it turns out that evolution runs just fine on pseudo-randomness. In fact, there are lots of simulations of evolution out there that have been done in the artificial life movement. And Carl Sims' wonderful Evolved Virtual Creatures is a lovely example of that. And the fact is, they don't use a quantum randomizer, they just use pseudo-random numbers. And with this mistake of thinking that evolution depends on really random mutation, it's very common. In fact, I was dismayed to see that no less a genius, a great scientist, than Francois Jacob, in his book Uncertainty, I think it's called, he makes this mistake. He says, if the universe weren't indeterministic, evolution couldn't happen. No, there's no evidence for that at all. The mere fact that we can get evolutionary processes, simulated evolutionary processes, to run on everyday, on your laptop, and producing a great flourishing of novel forms and adaptations and gradual improvement, shows that evolution depends on pseudo-randomness, but not on quantum randomness. Now, everything else that Abbas says there is, in a sense, is true. Or when he says, if the universe is really deterministic, then if we wound the tape back to before the Cambrian explosion and let her rip again, it would come out exactly the same. Well, only if we wound it back so perfectly that not a single bit was out of place. You change one bit, and an entirely different future would happen. And so the fact that, the metaphysical fact that given exactly that setup, the same thing follows, is of simply no relevance to whether evolution can happen.
So basically your answer is disagreeing with this basic premise.
Well, I'm saying that evolution does not depend on genuine randomness. It depends only on pseudo-randomness. That's enough. And the fact that we all want to be true, the idea that if we ran the tape of life again, it would come out entirely differently. Well, if we run the tape again and we just change a single bit somewhere, it'll run entirely differently. It'll amplify. This is the famous butterfly effect.
Yes, of course, chaos.
Yeah.
A butterfly spreads its wings and there's
And
a tornado.
And it changes the course of the weather, yeah.
Excellent. So I think that's a perfect setup for my next question to you, which is actually related to consciousness, something which I'm sure everybody like myself is very interested in. How does consciousness arise? And I just want to say a couple of words as a background of this question. Dan, I'm sure you know Antonio Damasio's work. In his fantastic book called Descartes' Error, he points out that Descartes' real error was really separating the mind and body, because so much of what we decide and have willingly think we are doing is determined by our emotions and our bodily functions. And in fact, I agree that the neural basis for our self is actively represented on the basis of two things. One is our autobiographical experiences. But the second is more interesting to me, which is the primordial bodily influences. You wake up one morning and you are snapping at everybody. Why? You don't understand. Maybe it's because your liver wasn't functioning properly. But it was happening at such a subconscious level that you're not aware of why you are feeling the way you are feeling. So our selves in a neural way are represented by both of these, our autobiographical experiences as well as our bodily experiences. In other words, the decisions we made are affected by this. So that's one part of this consciousness problem. The second is something you wrote in your book which made me think. You said that, let's say there is a couple, Herb and Alice, and they want to have a baby but in the new way. So what they do is they have their genome sequenced, and then they have these sequences entered into a computer, and the computer performs a meiotic meiosis on them, and then randomly combines the two genomes, and then this is placed into a human egg, and a baby Hal is born. Our mutual friend Craig Venter has gone a step further, and he is talking about biologic teleportation by this means, so that you can download sequences at one end, you transport them through cyberspace to another end, then you can construct proteins and viruses and even human cells. And the third part of this problem now is that we know very clearly now that if we have 1 trillion cells in our bodies, we have 10 trillion microbes living in us. Pathogens actually are far more than the number of cells in our body. And now, if consciousness, let's say according to David Chalmers' hypothesis, assigns a psychic experience to every electron, then a psychic experience is assigned to every microbe. And now we are just not collection of cells and DNA, but we have these trillions of creatures living in us that make a part of all of us. Then what is consciousness? Is it ever really possible to clone a human then? Because whatever you clone, even if you use the exact same DNA script, in the end that person will get colonized by a new set of microbes that they are exposed to. So you really can never clone. And what does this have? What do the natural flora that invade and contaminate us and our selfish genes is doing to our consciousness, if anything?
That's wonderful. The British physicist and mathematician Sir Roger Penrose, in his book The Emperor's New Mind, was very critical of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. But the reason I don't know if he said it in the book, but he said it to me in person in any case, what really motivated him to write that book and to conjure up a theory of quantum gravity of a sort that hasn't been seen yet, was the science fiction idea of teleportation, Craig Venter's idea. He viewed that as, he really wanted to show that that was impossible. And this was the main motivation, was to sort of pull a rug out from under this science fictional idea. But I don't think he's done that. And you point out correctly that our visitors outnumber our human host cells 10 to 1, not by weight, but by numbers.
Weight is about 10 pounds.
Yeah. It's just amazing.
10 pounds of us is just
Yeah,
in our body.
You're actually a walking colony. And think about it, each one of those microbes has its own genome. most of the DNA in your body is not human DNA. You've got your genome, but all the others, they have their genomes. So it's an incredible assemblage of different living things. But if you teleport, that all gets teleported, every last one of them. So, in the thought experiment, if you did it, the genomes of all the microbes would be teleported too, and they would be reconstructed. They're not left out of the equation. So I think teleportation doesn't really get us anywhere on this issue. I agree with Antonio Damasio, that the body plays an not just ineliminable but inseparable part of our minds. That is, we use our body, as he says, as a sort of sounding board, and a lot of our decision making really depends on getting feedback, just the way folk theory says. I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach, and that's what made me decide not to do this. Exactly. And maybe you don't even have a feeling that you can recognize from the pit of your stomach, but nevertheless, things going on outside of your central nervous system are nevertheless having a huge effect on how you see the world and how you decide things. So we're complicating our picture of cognitive science, and it means that the classical, good old-fashioned AI looks more and more simplistic. Yeah, our brains are, I still say our brains are a kind of computer, but they're very, very different from a laptop, because the 86 billion neurons you have, no two of them are alike, and each has an agenda. And there's nothing like that in your laptop.
Thank you. So I'm glad that you don't agree with the idea that it is either 40 hertz going up a threshold, as Crick said, or quantum mechanics working at the tubular level, as
no, I mean,
says.
There are various enthusiasms in the scientific world about what will explain consciousness, and most of them are fairly simplistic. It's, I guess I'm happy to say, more complicated than that.
I think my last question is going to take a very different route now. We've been hearing wonderful things about free will and a little bit about consciousness, and now I'm going to go to a third area that is also of interest to Professor Dennett. So I'll begin by quoting something from Professor Dennett's book called Breaking the Spell. In that book you write, "In the course of my research on this book, I found one opinion expressed in slightly different ways by people across the spectrum of religious views." And this is a kind of parody that Professor Dennett produced. "Man has a deep need for spirituality, but it is very hard for them to say what spirituality is. So if you ask them, this is the kind of thing. Spirituality is, like it's paying attention to your soul, or, having deep thoughts that really move you, and not just thinking about who's got nicer clothes and whether to buy a new car and what's for dinner and stuff like that. Spirituality is really caring and not being just, materialistic. And along with this common and unreflective view of spirituality goes a stereotype of the atheist. Atheists lack values, they're careless, self-centered, shallow, overconfident." You go on to say that what these people have realized is one of the best secrets of life. Let yourself go. If you can approach the world's complexities, both its glories and its horrors, with an attitude of humble curiosity, acknowledging that however deeply you have seen, you have only just scratched the surface. You will find worlds within worlds, beauties you could not heretofore imagine, and your own mundane preoccupations will shrink to proper size, not at all that important in the greater scheme of things. End of quote. And I bring this subject up because, first of all, I'd like to say before I even go on that there are many, many patients, cancer patients, my patients present in this room today, as are many doctors. I had a very famous patient when she died. The president of the university invited me to speak at her memorial service. And at this memorial service, there were very many famous people from Europe and America all across. And several individuals made this observation that Dr. So-and-so lived for 12 years with 4 cancers because she had a strong will to live, that she lived because of her positive thinking, that she lived because so many people were praying for her. And then her husband got up on stage. He happens to be my Heidegger's grandson. So he got on the stage and he said, "My wife lived for 12 years with 4 cancers, not because of positive thinking, not because of a strong willpower, and not because of prayers, but because of her oncologist." And he said, "The reason I say it is think about what you are saying for the patients who have died, that they had no free will, that they had no positive thinking, they had no one praying for them, and so you're blaming the victim." So there were many oncologists in the room, as there are today, who were silently applauding. But it made me think about something far more serious than that, which is that prayers and positive thinking certainly do not help any God, but they do help the person who's doing it. And those of us who are dealing with terminally ill patients 10 times a day on a daily basis, this is a very important thing, that all of us realize that whether you believe or not, that this is good for the person who is actually doing it. I had a very humbling experience. I went to Japan last month, and one of the things the Japanese did was that in Tokyo, they collected 100 patients and their families in a room. And with 4 interpreters, they had me there for 5 hours answering all their questions. And I say it was a deeply, deeply humbling experience because every single question that the Japanese patients asked me is the same questions that I'm asked here in New York. I was so affected by it, down to Dr. Raza, a 37-year-old, asking me, I have been going to church every day and praying, and down to, can I cook something different from my mother that will make her feel better? I stayed up that whole night and I wrote a long letter to my daughter telling her that anyone who feels like being a racist should simply come and attend one of these conferences. Nothing is more humbling and more equating than disease itself. And I wrote to her saying, if you are going to become a doctor for any other reason than just to serve the people who are suffering, then please go and do something else, become a plumber or whatever. It's not that there's anything wrong with being a plumber, but don't become a doctor. So with all this, what I'm trying to say is it's a very universal thing, and unfortunately, I have the feeling, and I have heard this over and over from so many people about today's lecture. Several people have refused to come to this lecture because Professor Dennett is a declared atheist, that they feel uncomfortable by his stance. Some people are afraid because of it. And I know that nothing could be farther from what you are writing. Had they read your books, they wouldn't be saying this. So this is why I bring up this subject with patients and doctors and everybody else in the room, so you can give us your view of all of this in a clear way to the people who are here. And I'm just sorry for the number of people who are not here today because of this reason.
Thank you, Azra. Yes, I'm an atheist, and first let me tell about my brush with death. 7 years ago, I had an aortic dissection and was saved by some very wonderful surgery and a great team at the Leahy Clinic. And in the aftermath of that, in fact, as soon as I came out of the anesthetic, I was very concerned about whether I was now a pumphead, as they say rudely, as somebody who's lost some marbles from having been on the heart-lung machine. So I sat right down to write an essay, and I wrote a piece called Thank Goodness, the point of which was, people knowing of my atheism had a lot of them had written to me to find out if I had had some epiphany, and I said, yeah, I had. My epiphany was that when I say thank goodness, that's not a euphemism, I mean it. Thank goodness. Thank the doctors, the science, the teamwork, and I went on to extol the wonderful accumulation of goodness in the world that had saved my life. Forget about thanking God. Thank the ones that are responsible. Eliminate the middleman. And when it I went on to say that some of my friends had the courage actually to tell me that they'd been praying for me. And I appreciated this. I did not respond as I wanted to. I was tempted to say, thank you, but did you also sacrifice a goat? And the reason that I felt like saying that was that they knew that I knew that intercessory prayer doesn't work. There's really very good evidence now, the Harvard study's out, and that by saying this, they were in effect challenging or ignoring, better let's say, ignoring something very important to me, and sort of flying in the face of what I believed. And although they thought they meant well, my view was, look, if you feel helpless and you want to help, don't make the mistake of thinking that praying is helping. Plant a tree, give money to Oxfam, do some volunteer work, lots of things you can do to help. You know that I don't think that praying does any good, and I have good evidence for that. And you're sort of dismissing my respect for empirical evidence by saying that you're praying for me. But this is just warming up to your question in a way, because what I think you want me to talk about, and I now will, is what about others who do pray or who do believe, and they're your patients? Would I raise a finger, let alone go out of my way, to try to disabuse them of their religious views and their practices as they fight for life? No, of course not. My own belief is that we're in a very awkward position in world history right now, where the belief in God is waning fast, and a lot of people are very anxious about this, and I don't blame them. Something which has been central to their lives is evaporating in front of their eyes in many cases. And I appreciate that this is painful and even terrifying, and I don't want to add to their pain. So I won't. I will, but at the same time, I've come to the conscientious decision, after much thought, that the traditional way of responding to this, which is, thou shalt not challenge religion, thou shalt not ask embarrassing questions about the doctrines of religion, that's now counterproductive. It's time to be more candid, more open about religion, and ease it as gracefully and gently off the sphere as we can, being concerned to minimize the anguish of those for whom this is a great loss. I know in my heart, and because of my experience, that you don't need God to be good, and you don't need God to be happy. And some of everybody's best friends, some of them are atheists without ever telling you, and they get along just fine. We don't need to be complicit anymore in the sort of hypocrisy of talking about this. There's going to be pain. In a piece that I just wrote for a volume about Philip Kitcher. Philip and I agree, he's at Columbia, that he's an atheist as much as I am, but he doesn't approve of my methods. And I said the difference between him and me is like the difference between two people about how to take off a bandage. Do you do it very slowly and carefully, or do you rip it off? And I'm of the rip it off school, because I think less suffering will happen. And I think that we don't know which of us is right, but it's it's a strategic choice, not anything else.
Thank you very much. I think I just wanted you to have a say about this. Now, apparently, somebody went to Niels Bohr's house, the great physicist who won the Nobel Prize, and they saw that there is a horseshoe outside this door. They said, Mr. Bohr, of all people, you're such an atheist, how can you have this horseshoe? And he said, oh, no, I've heard that even for people who don't believe, this brings them luck. So I'm very happy to take any questions now from the audience. And Simrit, what we'll have to do is pass the microphone around, which I don't know where it is. Okay, stand up then. This is Dr. Simrit Parmar. If you could, anyone asking a question, please identify yourself, who has traveled all the way from MD Anderson and a great transplanter from MD Anderson, come to pay tribute to Harvey. So please go ahead.
Professor Dennett, first of all, I think your views are very influential, and I think they are the vision. My question to you is, you think of it praying from a person who was praying for your health and you were sick, but what do you replace it with? Because praying provides a sense of hope. It provides a sense of, you may face a sense that it's deep into any anxiety, but it provides a lot of hope. So if you say that praying is critical or is not really doing anything for public work, how do you say it? I mean, how do you give that sense of hope to someone who is using that particular activity as such, but philosophically speaking, it bridges that level of anxiety and it needs to provide positive.
Good. I'm glad you asked the question, because I want to distinguish sharply between believing that if you're praying for somebody else, somebody who's in the hospital, intercessory prayer, you're saying prayers, cure Aunt Mary or whatever, if you think that's effective, it may be effective for you, but if you think it's effective for Aunt Mary, the empirical evidence is absolutely not. There's no evidence that it is. But it may be effective for you. And of course, if Aunt Mary is praying, it may be effective for her. And there is some evidence of that sort in which you wanted to speak to. And you want to know what I would replace that with. Well, we should always be on the lookout for crutches to help us deal with things that otherwise overwhelm us. And we do that all the time. Outside of religious connotations and religious prayer, a teacher may encourage a child with words that gets the child to have more self-confidence and hence do better on a test. But the teacher's words may be, at best, a self-fulfilling prophecy. She doesn't know whether the child will do well or not, but She knows that saying the child will do well may actually improve the child's performance. I think officially that's a misrepresentation. You're saying something you don't know and claiming to know it. But I think that's good. I think those are admissible, morally acceptable and even desirable things to do. I think that I would like to see well, I'm going to give you a particular example. Back in 1972, the documentary Oscar went to an amazing documentary called Marjoe, M-A-R-J-O-E. He had been the world's youngest evangelist, Marjoe Gortner, and then he came back after being off the evangelist circuit for a number of years, and with a documentary team, and they went around, and he's going to the revival meetings, and he's preaching hellfire and brimstone, and he's having people saving them for Christ and laying on his hands, and they're fainting, and they're making their decisions for Christ. And he's a complete fraud at this point, and you go backstage and you see they're dividing up the loot. It's quite lucrative. And he cons really thousands of people in this film. And it breaks your heart in some ways because they're so trusting. And you know, they must have signed those releases. If you thought Borat was a cruel film, wait till you see this one. And after I'd seen that, I've seen it actually several times, it really bothered me as whether he was doing good, actually, whether that whole circuit. Because you watched him at these meetings, and he's saying, now it's time for the offering. You open your wallets. If you've got a $20 bill, I want you to give me the $20 bill. If you've got 50, give me the 50. He's taking money from these poor people. But the other side of the question is, do they have anything better to spend it on? Are they getting more meaningful experience out of donating their last money to what they think of as the army of God, which they're now enlisted in? And I think that's a really serious question. But I would rather have charismatic people like Marjoe Gortner enlisting people for legitimate causes rather than for fantasies of this sort. Why can't we have real causes that we devote ourselves to with the passion and love that people devote to their religions? That's what I think we should be trying for.
Francois. Just wait for the
about the empirical evidence for prior not being effective in achieving any result. I have some little qualm with that statement because, first of all, I don't know what is a placebo of prior in a well-conducted experiment, as it would be completely tainted, obviously, by all kinds of subjective components. However, it's a bit quick to dismiss, on some of bad actors that undoubtedly are there. There are some bad actors that abuse credibility of people. Some other extremely very powerful examples, such as Lourdes, where people go there and get healed. And there are some testimonies that have been testified by physicians that are utmost integrity, that they are nothing short of miracles that occurred then with physical ailments that all of a sudden recovered. And so this is probably another example of prior, a counterexample of what you suggest, where there, with humility, we simply have to accept that there are things that we cannot really comprehend, but still do exist.
Well, the Harvard Benson study on intercessory prayer was the work of many years and was very carefully done and under the highest standards of statistical care and control. And since it was clear that the leaders of the study were hoping to get an effect, and to their credit, when they could not massage the data in any defensible way to find a positive effect, eventually after quite a long delay, they published the results. And I don't believe there's been any, I haven't seen any credible scientific challenge to the effects of that study. There have been other studies, but I don't think they have been anywhere near as careful or as controlled as that one. If there are, I'd be pleased to hear about them. And Lourdes and Rocamadour and all the other places where cures have been attested to, we don't know how many people went there to get cured and weren't cured. And we don't know how much spontaneous remission there is. I think that the jury's still out about the actual effects of going to any of these shrines. And as it might be, a lot of it may be placebo effects, very powerful placebo effects, which may be responsible for a great deal of it. I don't think that there's any secure empirical evidence for any miracle cures. There's lots and lots, hundreds, thousands of cases where people have remarkably improved, they've been cured, they've gotten better. But it's important to remember that those are the cases that get remembered and talked about and passed down. The cases of the people who tried that, tried everything with just as much heart and soul without any cure, are almost certainly orders of magnitude more. So if that's not true, I'd like to see some evidence of that. So I appreciate that there's differences of opinion about this, but I don't myself, having looked pretty hard, find any evidence of faith healing.
So what I wanted to say was that it's 12:20. I will take one more question because we really should have ended at 12 and food is getting cold and I'm sure everyone's hungry. But there is a very important person who's wanting to ask a question, and I'm going to invite Mr. Coleman to stand up, identify himself, and...
My name is Philip Coleman, and I'm a devout patient of Dr. Raza. My question deals with the possibility or the effect of collective consciousness. A number of years ago, I underwent surgery that lasted something like 7.5 hours. I was on a heart-lung machine for a number of hours. And in the operating room was a friend of mine from Switzerland who's a healer. My surgeon was very careful to interview all the staff that would be in the operating room to make sure that they were comfortable with a healer being present in the room. At the same time, I had friends from across the country, Moscow, sitting in deep meditation for me, as well as a number of people of different religions offering prayers, lighting novenas, And my feeling about this was that with the people that were praying and lighting candles for me, I felt that that was something that they were doing that promoted their good feelings towards me, and the entire group together was, for lack of better words, transmitting their love, caring, and good feelings to me in the operating room. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this concept and what your feelings are about it. Thank you.
I have often myself felt the urge to tell somebody, you know, I'll be praying for you. I'll be thinking of you. I'll be wishing you well. Don't you worry. I'll be thinking about you while you're in there in the surgery or whatever it is. I think that's it's reassuring for people to hear that, and then it's important that you not be lying, that you actually do it. At least then you're being honest with them and with yourself. I have no conviction that it works in any other way. For instance, I think telling, the fact is, you knew about these people going in.
Entirely.
Not all of them, but you knew about a lot of them. And that, I'm sure, was wonderful for your spirit, for your sense of perhaps calm, your courage as you went into the operation, because you knew about it. I think that's where the benefit comes, and I think it's probably in many cases great. The idea that there is some like extrasensory perception or some non-physical force at work here, I think there's no reason to believe that. I think that's extremely unlikely. And that's a well-studied topic to which I have nothing personally to add. But I do appreciate the importance of the ring of friendship around people who are in need, and letting them know that they're being thought of, and that people are waiting for them to get better and hoping that they'll get better. I think that's all very important, and I certainly wouldn't want to diminish that as a force in the world.
So one of my dearest friends was this famous Urdu writer, Qurratullain Haider. One day in frustration she said to me, "So Azra, you are a believer in evolution. What do you say when someone sneezes? Darwin bless you?" So I think Professor Dennett has agreed to be around for lunch, so many of you, I'm sure, have questions and welcome to talk to him. I'd like to end this symposium, which has been so intellectually stimulating, by first thanking you, Professor Dennett. You have been a hero of the Raza family, and I'm sure the audience is here just because of their great admiration for you. Deeply, deeply honored by your presence. And I'd like to end by telling you a joke which I loved from the book again that Professor Dennett has written along with his graduate students. So in this story, two strangers, a man and a woman, ended up having to share an overnight train ride in the same compartment, the sleeping compartment. So after this initial discomfort of this strange man and woman being together, they decided, okay, she'll take the top berth, he'll sleep on the lower berth, and they went to sleep. In the middle of the night, she wakes him up and she says, "Excuse me, I'm really cold. Can you please pass me this blanket from the closet. So he looks up and he says, Madam, for one night, can we not just pretend as if we are married? So she thinks for a few minutes and then she says, well, okay, why not? So he said, then get your own blanket. Thank you, Professor.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.